So I'm very happy to introduce Andy's talk, dissertation defense seminar. Andy is finishing his dissertation through E-IPER. He came to Stanford after doing his undergraduate in Leipzig in Germany, and then a master in environmental science from the University of Turku in Finland. And he's been here at Stanford and finished his dissertation right on time in 5 years. We are very lucky to have the chance to keep him here actually through the fourth quarter. He's going to stay through the end of the year, and then he has a postdoc waiting for him at Columbia University starting in January. As you will see, the focus of Andy's dissertation has been spatial mapping of human activities, which is information that is critical for spatial management of oceans. And he has addressed uncertainty through computational experiment and machine learning. And so you will see what he has come up with and all the interesting results that he has contributed to this field. I tried to get Andy in the field and drag him to Baja his first summer. And that experience, I think, was very positive because being stuck on an island, he actually had a lot of time to take walks and what he wanted to do. And he came back with all this great idea for his dissertation work that were far better than what we had discussed about doing in the field, so it was very useful in that sense. And so, just as a lesson for all of us, I recommend spending a few weeks with no internet. What's going to happen is that this is the public presentation of his work, so we give a seminar, there will be time for questions and answers by everyone, and then we will take him away to room 253 for the defense part with his committee. We will be down by 1 or before, and at 1 o'clock there's a reception up on the second floor balcony where there's going to be food and drinks to celebrate. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
All right, thank you, Theo. Thanks everyone for coming today. My dissertation is titled Uncertainty Analysis and Regression Models for Marine Human Impact Mapping. And a large part of this presentation, as Theo said, will be about uncertainty in maps. And one part of my background is that I'm a cartographer and I really like maps. So maps can be very beautiful. This, for example, is a map of Northern Europe from 1539. And they are also very useful. We use them for navigation, for planning, for understanding the world better. Especially old maps also tell us where all the sea monsters are, so that we don't get eaten when we travel by sea. And seriously, being a cartographer is a very different job today, because most maps today are made with computers, and most maps show the outputs of one or another computer model. And that is the second part of my background. I have been originally trained as a computer scientist, and that has somehow left me with strong distrust of anything that comes out of a computer. And this is pretty much the story of how I got to write a dissertation about uncertainty in computer-generated maps. And the particular species of maps that we're going to look at today are maps of human impact on the oceans. Such maps are needed because people affect the oceans in many ways. For example, of 600 marine fish stocks monitored by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, about 1/4 are classified as overexploited. According to the International Maritime Organization, more than 90% of the world's trade is carried by sea. And heavily used routes like the English Channel are navigated by hundreds of ships each day. Other human activities that affect the oceans take place on land. For example, a recent study estimated that between 4.8 and 12.7 million tons of plastic enter the oceans each year. There are also many local uses, especially in coastal areas like marine aquaculture, offshore oil exploration and extraction, and many others. And all this happens, of course, against the background of climate change. And as a consequence, in most of the oceans, there are several human activities or human uses that are taking place together. For example, fishing and shipping. And the reason that I'm showing you this slide is to just give you a conceptual model and to make sure that when I keep talking about human stressors and impacts that you know what I actually mean by these terms. So each of these human activities can generate one or more stressors. For example, bottom trawling, a kind of fishing where the gear is being dragged over the sea bottom, directly removes biomass, that would be one stressor, but it also abrades the sea bottom, and that would be another stressor. And the same stressor can also be caused by different human activities. For example, underwater noise is caused by both shipping and marine construction works. And in the end, these stressors affect marine organisms and thereby potentially also populations, communities, and whole ecosystems. But before discussing the spatial extent of human impacts on the ocean, I want to orient you to the structure of my presentation. First, I will introduce you to a widely used spatial model for making maps of human impact on marine ecosystems. And then I will present some of my own work. And I will first talk about uncertainty in existing marine human impact maps. And second, I will share two demonstration studies that explore if regression models, and in particular machine learning methods, are a feasible alternative to the existing approaches for marine human impact mapping. Today, the human footprint stretches to the most remote corners of the oceans. And this has been very powerfully demonstrated with the map that you're seeing here. Just to orient you, the map does not show some measurable biological quantity, but a kind of human impact index. And the red and the orange areas are essentially places where, according to this model, people have major effects on the oceans, and the blue and green areas are respectively areas that are relatively unaffected by people. The map was published in Science in 2008. It received a lot of attention from academics when it came out, also from public media outlets. It was featured, for example, in the New York Times and on NPR. And there are two major conclusions that can be drawn from this map and that have both been supported by independent lines of research. First, people affect the oceans essentially everywhere. And second, most of the oceans are affected by several human activities and stressors at the same time. And besides these two important insights, this paper also made a big methodological contribution in the way in which the map was created. It is based on a quite simple spatial model. So how does this model work? It uses two kinds of spatial data. First, it uses data on the spatial distribution of different human activities and stressors, for example, commercial shipping. Second, it uses data about the spatial distribution of different ecosystem types, for example, coral reefs, but also broad-scale habitats like continental shelf soft bottoms. And it brings these spatial data together by means of so-called sensitivity weights. And these are just numbers that represent how sensitive each of the ecosystem types is to each of the stressors, and they are typically derived by expert judgment. This model has now been used in more than 20 regional studies, creating more detailed local human impact maps for specific marine regions. And the recent review found that more than half of recent studies assessing broad-scale human impacts on marine ecosystems or ecosystem condition in general have used this model. Many more have used models that are similar and at least share its core assumptions. So while this is not the only model for making marine human impact maps, it is by far the most widely used. And it's not just some academics making maps. Most of the regional studies argue that the maps can inform marine spatial planning and management. For example, one of these papers states that the cumulative impact index is a tool which can be applied to marine spatial planning, environmental impact assessments, placement and management of marine protected areas, permitting processes, and also in environmental status, pressure, and impact assessments, such as those required by the EU MSFD. That's the European Union's Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And in fact, I do not know how, if at all, the maps have influenced environmental decision-making. But it's interesting to note that several of these studies have been initiated and funded by national and international environmental protection agencies. For example, the Helsinki Commission, which is the international body in charge of environmental protection of the Baltic Sea. So there is certainly much interest in this from the side of environmental managers, planners, and regulators. But if the maps are to be used in practice and actually inform decisions related to environmental protection, then it's important to make sure that they are sufficiently accurate. And unfortunately, the model has several limitations that have been very widely discussed in the literature. There are definitely some serious issues with data quality, especially for large and international study areas. The model also makes many assumptions that are at odds with the complexity of marine ecosystems and human impacts on them that we know about from experimental and field work. For example, the model assumes that the effects of multiple stressors simply add up without any interactions, but there are literally hundreds of experimental studies demonstrating that, in fact, stressor interactions are pretty common in nature. And all these assumptions would not matter so much if we could simply test the model against field data. And in fact, several studies have tried to do this, and they have had very mixed results. And part of the problem is that these maps show a kind of human impact index. And when you're having a human impact index of 16 in one place and of 11 in another place, it is not totally obvious what kind of data would be needed to either confirm or falsify this result. And for this reason, quantifying uncertainty in the existing human impact maps remains an unresolved but important research problem. And this is what I'm trying to do with one part of my dissertation. So the first question that my dissertation seeks to answer is how much uncertainty there is in existing marine human impact maps based on the human impact index model that I just explained. And I address this in the first two chapters of my dissertation. Then in the second part of my dissertation, I explore if alternatively regression models can be used to make maps of human impact on marine ecosystems. And the idea here is to, rather than making assumptions about things that we don't really know, like stressor interactions, to try and extract these relationships from data. And for this purpose, I will draw to a large extent on machine learning methods. My dissertation addresses these questions in 4 chapters. The first chapter develops the uncertainty and sensitivity analysis methods for spatial human impact models and demonstrates them based on 2 regional human impact maps. My second chapter then is more applied and applies these methods to the global map of human impact on marine ecosystems that I just showed you. And the third and fourth chapters then serve as demonstration studies for the use of regression models and machine learning in particular for human impact mapping. Well, let's begin with the first 2 chapters. And just to remind you, the question here is how much uncertainty there is in the existing human impact maps. Before explaining my methods, I want to point out that there have been previous uncertainty analysis for these kind of maps. Several studies looked at the effects of 1 or perhaps 2 or 3 specific model assumptions or data quality problems, like errors in expert judgment, and found that in virtually all cases, these things do not affect the maps very much. And the model is therefore generally seen as robust. I have 2 concerns, however. First, these studies considered only 1 or only a few sources of uncertainty. And second, if they considered more than 1, they tested their effects one by one in isolation. But even if individual sources of uncertainty do not affect the maps very much, it is still possible that in combination, they have large effects. And so when I started working on this, we still essentially had no idea how much the various model assumptions and data quality problems taken together actually affect the maps that a model generates. And in order to estimate this aggregate uncertainty from all the sources, I used Monte Carlo simulations. I first obtained the data to reproduce 3 previously published human impact maps. I reproduced 2 regional maps, one for the Baltic Sea and one for the Mediterranean and Black Seas, as well as the global map. And as a note, the global map has been updated in 2015, and all the analysis that I'm showing today are based on the updated data. After getting together the data and reproducing the original maps, I generated 3,000 human impact maps with different ecologically plausible model assumptions and random errors in the input data. And for this purpose, I identified 9 model assumptions and data quality problems, which I will call factors from now on. So factors is just short for all the sources of uncertainty that I tested. And I created this list based on a literature review using 2 criteria. First, all of these factors have been discussed as potentially problematic in the literature. That means I'm not the only person who is actually concerned about them. And second, I only included sources of uncertainty that could be modeled in a justifiable way based on the current state of knowledge. And I will use the assumption that ecosystems respond linearly to stress to show you what I mean by that. So in the plots on this slide, there are a few more coming. The x-axis represents the intensity of a hypothetical stressor. And the y-axis represents the size of its effect on a hypothetical ecosystem. And the original model simply assumes that these relationships are linear, like in the plot on the left. However, empirical research suggests that ecosystems often respond non-linearly to stress, as in the 2 plots in the middle. So these are empirically derived for a small study area in Italy. And in this case, they show a kind of threshold response, meaning that low levels of stress have very little effect on the ecosystem, but once stressor intensity crosses a threshold, there are major effects very quickly. And I added this possibility to the model, like in the idealized response curves in the plot on the right. So now the problem is, of course, that we in most cases don't know which ecosystem responses are linear and which are nonlinear, and if they're nonlinear, where the thresholds would be. So when I generated my 3,000 maps, I randomly assigned different response functions and thresholds to all the different ecosystem types and stressors. So there were some maps where almost all responses were linear. There were some maps where almost all responses were nonlinear, and in most it was a varying proportion of both. And for each map that I generated, I did not only change the shape of the response functions or any other of the factors, but I changed them all together at the same time. So these are just 4 examples of the 3,000 maps that I generated. Each map was based on different assumptions, and each had different errors in the input data. And as a last step, I asked if there were any spatial patterns that most of the maps actually agreed on. And this required, of course, specifying in advance what kinds of pattern I was looking for. For example, I asked which parts of the oceans were among the most and the least impacted 25% of the study areas. This figure integrates information from all 3,000 maps that I generated. And the red, and to a lesser extent the orange areas, were among the most impacted parts of the oceans in most of the maps. So these results are robust. And by robust, I mean that we would find them under a wide range of model assumptions and even under major errors in the input data. And similarly, the blue and the light blue areas show robust low-impact areas. And in this map, I've just added the most and least impacted 25% of the oceans according to the original map. And these are the yellow and the green areas that just popped up. And if we compare the overlap of these areas, what we find is that of the 25% of the oceans that were most impacted according to the original map, about 37% were confirmed in at least three quarters of the maps that I created. And the remaining 63% were not robust using these particular thresholds. The 2 lower bars that just popped up show the same results for the Mediterranean and Black Seas and for the Baltic Sea. The 2 regional studies that I conducted in the same way, but for which I won't have time to show you any detailed results. But very roughly speaking, the proportions are more or less similar. And the bottom part of the chart shows the same as above, but for the least, not the most impacted, 25% of the oceans. And one thing that is quite noticeable here is that the proportion of robust results is higher for the least impacted areas for the global map and for the Baltic Sea, but not for the Mediterranean and Black Seas. And this occurs because both globally and in the Baltic Sea, there are big areas that see little direct human use. So yes, they are affected by global stressors like climate change and by pollution that is transported from far away, but there is not much more going on. And because there is not much more going on, no matter what assumptions we make and how we put together the data, these areas always appear to be among the least impacted in the world in comparative terms. So the answer to my first research question, how much uncertainty is in the existing maps, is that there is definitely more uncertainty than previous studies suggested. And the reason that this uncertainty has not been identified before is that earlier work looked at single sources of uncertainty in isolation as opposed to their aggregate effects. But it's also important to note that there were large areas that consistently came up as highly impacted or as little impacted in most of the generated maps. And if the maps are to be used for environmental management and planning, then it's important to distinguish such robust results from results that are more sensitive to model assumptions and data quality. I therefore think that any study creating a human impact map based on this model should conduct similar analysis. But I am also aware that not everyone is in the fortunate situation to be a graduate student who can just spend a year or two on analysis like this. So for this reason, I have published an open source software tool that has a graphical user interface. It's free, there's a tutorial, it can just be downloaded. And this tool can conduct the kind of analysis that I just presented with a few mouse clicks. And an advantage of the Monte Carlo approach that I used is that there are no data necessary beyond the data that would be required to make the map in the first place. And while it also has some limitations, I really hope that this tool will get more researchers to actively explore uncertainty in the human impact maps that they create. And I don't really know if that plan is going to work out. I've checked yesterday, the software has been downloaded about 200 times over the last year, and I know of 3 projects that are currently using it. They're all in Northern Europe, where people like me especially for some reason. So fingers crossed, we might see more uncertainty analysis for human impact maps in the future. Besides uncertainty analysis, the software can also conduct, and I have also conducted sensitivity analysis. And just to distinguish this, uncertainty analysis asks how much uncertainty there is in a given model output, whereas sensitivity analysis aims to attribute this uncertainty to the different sources. And we won't have time to get into this very deeply, but I want to show you one key result from the sensitivity analysis that I conducted for the same study regions that we just talked about. So in this plot, each group of 3 bars represents one of the 9 factors that I tested. And within each group, each bar represents a study area. So for example, blue is our results for the global map. The height of each bar influence broad-scale spatial patterns in the respective maps. And I estimated this using a method called the elementary effects method, or Morris method. And I won't have time to explain it here in detail. But I just caution you that some limitations of the method I would not put, but rather in broad and qualitative terms. So what the main message from this chart is that in each of the study areas, there were several factors that had in magnitude comparable effects on the broad-scale spatial patterns in the maps. So for example, for the global map, missing data was the most important source of uncertainty, but there are also 5 other factors with bars that are not that much smaller. Well, yes, perhaps 30% or something like that, but not a lot. And unfortunately, this suggests road to improving the model will be very long. Because even if we could get all the data that we want, even if we could get the expert judgment perfectly right, even if we could get the ecosystem responses perfectly right, there would still be several other important sources of uncertainty remaining. So there's just no silver bullet for improving the model. And this is one of the reasons for why I think it's also very important to investigate alternative modeling approaches. And that gets us to the second part of my dissertation, which asks if regression models, in particular machine learning algorithms, are a feasible alternative for this purpose. I investigated this in my third and fourth chapters, and we won't have time to look in detail into either of them. And I'll instead give you a very broad overview of what the general idea is, and then I'll show you two key results that illustrate how it worked out. So what is machine learning? And that's actually a very hard question to answer because it is a very broad field that deals with methods and algorithms for understanding data and for making predictions. And here I'm only going to make use of a small subset of that field, the subset that deals with regression and prediction. And you will note that there is a lot of overlap between machine learning and statistical modeling in general. Machine learning historically came out of computer science departments. It has really grown together with related work in statistics into one big collection of modeling approaches that all have in common that they put data at the center. So conceptually, our problem is exactly the same in both of the chapters. So first we have a response, and that is just the dependent variable. That's the variable that we want to predict. We also have one or more predictors, and these are the independent variables. So these are the data that we already have and that we'll base our prediction of the response on. And the problem now is to link the response to the predictors. And in order to do this, we are looking for a function f that takes the predictors and gives us an estimate of the response that is, on average, as close as possible to the true value of the response. And machine learning, as I'm using it here, is just a collection of methods, some of which come from very classical statistics, to find f and to estimate how good it is. And then the best f that we can find will be the model that we'll use to make maps. I want to point out here that this is a very different modeling approach from the human impact index models that I talked about earlier. So there, the model consisted of a fixed set of rules about how to put the different input data together. Here, in contrast, we still have to provide some structure to our model, but how exactly the predictors are combined within the structure is learned from the data. And to apply this to human impact mapping, the idea is to use ecological indicators of overall ecosystem condition and that are sensitive to human stressors as responses for these models. So what would we gain if we could make this work? So first, as I just mentioned, we would not create maps that show an abstract human impact index, but we would create maps that show specific ecological indicators. And these indicators can be chosen based on environmental concerns and management goals in whatever our study area is. Second, rather than making assumptions about relationships that we don't know about, we could ideally extract this information from the data. And third, and as someone who is interested in uncertainty in maps, I find this very exciting, we would also get good estimates of the prediction errors. That is, we would know approximately how accurate the maps that we are making are. And I will now walk you through what I did in my third and fourth chapters. And I keep it at a very broad level. The study area in my third chapter is the Baltic Sea, and that's a semi-enclosed hypersaline sea in Northern Europe. It has only a shallow and narrow connection to the open ocean, but it has a large and in parts very densely populated catchment, and it's therefore dominated by freshwater input from rivers. Some people call it the largest estuary in the world. And the main environmental problem in the Baltic Sea is water quality, and in particular, eutrophication. Besides different pollutants, the rivers bring in high levels of nutrients, mostly from agriculture, and This then leads to large algal plumes in the spring and summer, which in turn have a number of undesirable consequences, like frequent hypoxia. In my fourth chapter, the study area will be the coast of California, and I'll keep this really short because I think most of you know the California coast, and if you don't, you should go there this afternoon. It's a very different marine system from the Baltic Sea, mostly because much of the coast is just facing the open ocean. And for California, I did not look at water quality, but at biodiversity and fish biomass along the coast as overall indicators of ecosystem condition. So let's talk about the data that I used in each of the chapters. In the Baltic Sea, as I mentioned, the main environmental problem is eutrophication. And one indicator that is very commonly used to keep track of the problem is Secchi depth. And that is just a measure of water transparency, and it's very simple. Essentially, you are lowering a standardized disk into the water, and you note at which depth it disappears from your site. And it's obviously quite cheap to obtain such data, and therefore they are very easily available. There's a large public archive for the Baltic Sea that goes back to the beginnings of the 20th century. So the response here will be Secchi depth. What about the predictors? Unfortunately, the human activities that cause eutrophication, like agriculture, mostly take place on land and far away from where we actually see the consequences. So we cannot directly link them statistically. But we can see phytoplankton concentrations near the water surface, which largely depend on the in situ nutrient level from space. And this slide example, it's a large algal plume, which you can see at these greenish swirls in the water in the central and southern Baltic Sea, as seen from a satellite. So in this chapter, I used satellite data as predictors, but I also included some additional data that I thought might be helpful, like surface salinity levels from hydrodynamic model hindcasts. So these are the data that I used for the Baltic Sea. And in total, I had 199 Secchi depth observations that also had satellite data for the same place and day. But before getting into more details here, I'd like to talk about the data for the California coast. So for California, I used 3 ecological indicators as response, measures of biodiversity and biomass in kelp forests and of biodiversity in rocky intertidal habitats. These data were collected by PISCO, the Partnership for the Interdisciplinary Study of Coastal Oceans, and they were put together and curated by my collaborators, Alison Haupt and Megan Mack, and I'm very grateful for this because it saved me months of work. So again, I was very lucky that I could draw on existing data to do this work rather than having to get wet feet myself. I liked it. So depending on the indicator, these data sets consisted of typically between 100 and 150 observations. As predictors, I used human use and stressor data from a human impact index for the California current. So here the predictors were the same data that would go into a human impact index map like those that we discussed earlier in this presentation. And to link the predictors to the response, for the Baltic Sea, I considered only 2 types of models, mostly because this is work I did 4 years ago, and I learned a few things since then. So linear least squares and generalized additive models. I chose variables for the models based on best subset selection and Monte Carlo cross-validation, and I estimated their prediction accuracy using an independent validation set. For the California coast, I used 8 types of models. Some of them were very constrained models, like ridge regression, and others were very flexible models like boosted regression trees. And by flexible, I just mean that these models can represent very complicated nonlinear relationships and interactions between the different predictors. And I tuned the models, estimated their prediction errors, and selected the model that worked best based on nested spatial block cross-validation. But as a short interlude, it might not be obvious why we're not simply using the most flexible model that we can find. Because after all, we know that the relationships that we're modeling are really complicated. And that is because of the so-called bias variance trade-off. And in short, this means that especially when we have small sample sizes and low signal-to-noise ratio, more flexible models tend to overfit. And this means that they pick up idiosyncrasies of our sample rather than the general patterns in the data that we are actually after. So it's not a priori clear which kinds of models would work best for this. And now I want to move on to share one key result from each of the chapters. And for my third chapter, this key result are the SecuDep maps. And this chapter was almost a little bit boring because everything worked out roughly as expected. The process that I just explained gave me a model that predicted SecuDep based on satellite images and that I used to make the SecuDep maps that you're seeing on the slide. And as expected, generalized additive models, the more flexible ones, worked somewhat better than linear models. Such maps make it possible to monitor eutrophication at very broad spatial scales and over time. And they are also used as input for different ecological models because the more turbid the water is, which is what SecuDep essentially measures, the less light is available underwater for photosynthesis. So having more accurate SecuDep maps is therefore important for monitoring eutrophication, but also for some modeling applications. And I found that compared to the only other regional scale SecuDep maps that were publicly available at the time, on an independent validation set, these maps had about 50% lower errors. And I think that, therefore, this chapter is quite a good demonstration of the potential that regression models in general and machine learning in particular has for creating maps that show specific kinds of human impacts. For my fourth chapter, California Coast, the main result that I would like to share today is not a map, but which models work best. And this chart shows mean squared errors for predicted fish biomass in kelp forests along the coast of California, and we won't have time to look at any other indicators now. I'd like to point out that the x-axis doesn't start at 0, and also that the errors were estimated with spatial block cross-validation, which is a very hard test. It essentially estimates the extrapolation error of the model. That means how well the model does for whole subregions of the study area for which it has not seen any data before. And of course, as these are error bars, the smaller the errors are, the better is the model. And we won't have time to talk about how all these different models are working, but what's important here is that as we're moving down in this chart, the models become more flexible, generally speaking. And please don't get obsessed with the exact order here, but just very generally, the more we move down, the more flexible we get. And by being flexible, I mean that some of the models can represent very complicated nonlinear and interactive relationships. And in this case, the model that made the best predictions was ridge regression. And that is one of the least flexible models that I tested. And I won't have time to explain exactly how it works, but you can think of it as linear regression with an added penalty for large coefficients. So it's linear regression with some additional constraints on top of it. And if you know Lasso, I know some of you do, ridge regression is very similar, just uses a different formulation of the penalty. And what's really important to the point that I'm trying to make is really that, yeah, it was one of the most inflexible models that performed best. And in contrast, the more flexible models performed worse because they overfitted to the noise in the data. And this finding was the same for the two other indicators that I ran these analyses for. So the answer to my second broad research question is that, yes, machine learning and regression models definitely have potential for making maps of ecological indicators that represent certain types of human impacts. But in order to make full use of their potential to represent the complexity of the problem that I'm trying to model, we will need data that have either much larger sample sizes or a much higher signal-to-noise ratio. And at least for the areas that I have been working in, both while at Stanford and before Northern Europe, what seems to be the bottleneck really are not the biological data, but good maps of human uses and stressors. And while my focus after graduating will be mostly on remote sensing, I also plan to continue along this human impact mapping line of research and searching for a study area where such high quality data may be available or easy to obtain will be one of my next steps along this path. And if you know such an area, please let me know. All right. And before transitioning to the acknowledgements and answering your questions, I would like to return to one of the topics that I only briefly brought up in the beginning of my talk. And that topic is sea monsters. So cartographers in the Middle Ages used to put monsters onto their maps because they did not know what was out there. And apparently they also didn't know what was not out there. So we know a lot more now, right? We put small devices onto whales and sharks to see what they do underwater, and we send people to the deep sea, and we send robots to the deep sea, and we have robots who cross the seas and take measurements for us, and we understand to some extent how we affect biogeochemical cycles and all these things. And we, for these reasons, rarely see monsters in maps anymore. But I wonder if, I certainly have the urge, I wonder if perhaps sometimes we should put them back on. Just to remind us that there are many things that we still don't know. Thank you for your attention. And thank you. Before the question session, I have some acknowledgements to make. My committee is the best that I could wish for. So when I started here, I had all kinds of crazy ideas, and I was close to getting lost in them, I think. And Mag, you have been really great in making sure that I'm getting on track eventually while still leaving me a lot of room to explore the ideas that I had. And I really appreciate that and the deep insights into all kinds of environmental topics that you shared with me over the years. And then once I was on track, Theo, it has been amazing to work with you on all of the projects that I presented today. Larry, you have been helping me from literally my first week here with anything from academic careers over research, of course, to personal things, and I thank you very much for that. And David, yeah. So one of the first things that I did here is take a class from David, and essentially this is my extended class project. So more or less everything that I the fundamentals I learned from you, and it was great to work with you as I developed all these ideas further. Thank you, Lisa, for being the chair today. I really appreciate that. Thanks to my collaborators, Alison, Megan, and Ben. Alison and Megan, as I already mentioned, shared data with me, which saved me months of work doing something that I'm not good at doing. And Ben Halpern just shared some incredible insights into human impact mapping in general with me that have really shaped the story that I'm telling about it. I've had a number of mentors, both at Stanford and before I came here, who have very much influenced who I am intellectually and how I'm thinking about and how I'm approaching problems. And E-IPER stuff. It's very difficult to say something original about E-IPER stuff because they're really great, and at every dissertation defense, they just get the highest praises. So thank you, Sue, Ben, Anne-Marie, and Anjana, and also past staff members who are not here today. I think the one thing that I can add is that I have been working in various departments and also in some private companies. But I have never felt that the people who were running the place I was working in were so invested in my well-being and success. And I see everyone nodding who is an E-IPER, so that is really true. So thank you very much for that. And the last category, fellow students, friends, and family. I started to make a list of names, and then I realized that that was impossible, and I stopped doing it. So one of the great joys of being in E-IPER was, for me, working in the E-IPER suite, because I go there and I meet people who I like, and when I go to the coffee maker, which I do a lot actually, there's always someone to chat about the politics of the day or whatever is going on, and that will be the thing that I'm missing, that I will be missing most when I'm leaving this place. I also have friends who are not in E-IPER, or even, I have two of them, Clayton and Enrica. I'm talking about you. So, and it's really strange, because when I get old, in 50 years or so, I am planning to be this kind of old person who walks around and tells all the stories to anyone who is not running away quickly enough. And for some reason, I'm pretty sure that the stories that I'm going to tell will not be so much about how I sat in the office and wrote my dissertation, but it will be more about some of the adventures that we and other friends have been having. And I can also say the same to my wife, Christina, who is also my best friend. So this picture shows us celebrating midsummer in northern Sweden. And then we decided we need to move to California. No. And I really can't thank you enough for being yourself and being my partner in everything. And also for your patience. I promise you only a couple of hours and I will be normal again. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
So we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions from the group. We can run over a little bit. Okay. So just questions, and you can.
Okay, Dan.
Andy, that was fantastic. Really
Thanks.
sophisticated ideas explained very clearly. Thank you, especially for me. Thank you. So you mentioned that these maps really have, especially the cumulative impact maps, really get a lot of play as sort of the policy sort of practitioner setting. And I'm curious, since you have now revised the maps to make them we're better, more insightful what might actually happen. I'm curious if you've had the opportunity to engage in any sort of conversations with policymakers and practitioners about how to sort of better live and utilize these data. Or do you plan to?
Yes, I would love to do this. I don't know to what extent I will have the opportunity to do it. Quite generally, I don't think anybody other than the people who may using them actually know how they are using the maps. What I do know from my time as a consultant for different, with clients, with different public sector clients who were really interested in this map is that yes, the interest is there. Some of it comes from the fact that at least in Northern Europe, in the whole European Union, countries are legally mandated to assess human impacts on the waters under their jurisdiction. And that seemed to many of them, I believe, a good way to do it. It definitely has some effects. I think one of the greatest advantages of doing is that it forces you to actually put together consistent data sets for all the different regions and countries that you're including in your analysis. But besides that, I know that it's been in some policy reports as look what we've done and what kind of advanced techniques we are using to understand what's going on in our waters. But yeah, if it has really affected decisions, I do not know that. What I hope is with this work is to bring more attention to uncertainty because, and this is just something that I'm telling you from my experience, people who are making decisions and are making policy really like research results that support the positions that they are holding anyway, right? bringing some attention to uncertainty and trying to get a more sophisticated conversation other than, well, the map shows it is that way, and then as a response, but the model is not good. That is one of the main objectives that I had. But how exactly this is going to be picked up, I'm excited to see it. And I will try to advise people according to experience. When I advise people, they do not always listen. So.
I get another question.
Yeah, just go ahead.
I'm curious what, all the conversation about thresholds and, picking the factors that inform the model. That you pick 75% as your cutoff for the more robust maps that you generate. I'm just curious, is there anything about 75%? Did you do any sensitivity analysis on that threshold?
No, there's not. I've also tried others. So I just did not show all the small technical details of this work. And if you try others, what happens is what you'd expect. The more strict you make the thresholds, the less robust results you will actually find. Larry?
So I have a question that I actually came to my mind here this summer for the first time. But I'm interested in chapters 3 and 4, when you do the uncertainty analysis, you're allowing all of the 9 factors that you have to vary at the same time in the model. And the question is, did you explore the covariance relationship between those the 9 factors? Because if they co-vary, then changing them all at the same time could inflate the estimate of uncertainty, I'm guessing, right? Straighten me out if I'm wrong. I'm just interested if you change all those factors at once and you allow them all to vary, the data to vary with random variables and so on. If those things are correlated with each other, then you may be inflating the uncertainty. Is that?
That was not a problem in this case because I know they are all independent, because I am the one who is essentially drawing the random numbers. And that is one of the big advantages of doing computational experiments, is that you have perfect control over every single thing that is happening. There is no confounding whatsoever. And in this case, I'm just setting the ecological thresholds, for example, completely independently of all the other things that are happening. And therefore, especially with many simulation runs, it is extremely unlikely that if there's any covariance, it will only be by chance.
Okay, but I guess I'm wondering about, I understand what you did in the model, but in the real world, the question is, do those factors co-vary with each other?
Oh, this is about the last chapters. Yeah. Okay, so I said it, but I kind of forget it by the end of your question. I was already thinking. Yes, the predictors co-vary. This is one of the reasons that I'm not drawing any inferences. And you're actually onto something really important here. First of all, all the predictors are spatially, and they also co-vary. And this means that a lot of normal statistical methods and also many machine learning methods will essentially fail. In this situation, you will get downward biased error estimates, so you will be much more confident in your model than you should be. And you will also choose more flexible models than would actually be good. And I forgot about this when I started working on this, and this is exactly what I found. So the way I address this is in the way that I set up the different types of cross-validation and that I weighted observations when fitting the models. And there are a number of techniques on this. It seems to be a relatively unexplored field, but there are a few papers. I think the key paper that is addressing this issue that gave me the idea how to actually avoid biased error estimates and choosing two flexible models because of the correlation, came out only a couple of months ago. And it was kind of a rescue for me. So,
I guess, you know, I mean, obviously the one-at-a-time changes are wrong. And the question is change everything at the same time wrong, in the sense of trying to assess what the overall impact of uncertainty is. It may be hard to know that. Just curious.
oh, okay. So now we're back to the first two chapters.
No, I'm still on chapter.
Okay. Sorry, I did not understand this question. Can you please? Wait. Okay.
Andy, is your model useful for helping to predict or understand if you generate qualitatively different alternative stable states in these ecosystems? So specifically chapters 3 and 4, like, could you say, oh, in this first stable state, it looks like phytoplankton is the greatest predictor of unification, but actually we crossed some nonlinear threshold, and now all of a sudden the original model that was trained on this first stable state fails in the second stable state. Could you use that to detect state transitions in the ecosystem?
Well, you would see the state transitions in the responses, wouldn't you? So you essentially, the state transitions, they would be expressed in the ecological indicators that we're looking at, right? And and I think that these models, I don't think they can actually detect them. They can, if you have data from before the transition and after transition, you might be able to draw inferences about what were the causes behind the transition. But, you know, at face, these relationships are only correlational. There needs to be some more evidence. And because many of the predictors, at least that I'm using, are correlated, essentially drawing inferences from this model, causal inferences, is something that I would not recommend at all.
I wonder, you mentioned that you were mostly on remote sensing after this, and I'm wondering, for this issue of human impact mapping emotions, what is sort of the current use of remotely sensed data? Do you feel like there are opportunities that are being missed? Is there data that should be put to more use to improve these kind of maps or not?
Yes, and to answer this, I will think about remote sensing very broadly, so perhaps not only satellites. For creating the type of human impact index maps, for example, you need very good maps of where different ecosystem types occur. For example, where kelp forests occur. And some of these things can be seen from satellites. So that is one way in which remote sensing could be used there. It's just a lot of work, and I think that typically the people making the maps might not have the resources to spend months on a single data set. Then water quality is an obvious example, not just SecuDepth, but essentially everything that happens near the water surface and has a color attached to it in a way is something where we can come in with remote sensing. There is some high-resolution imagery that you could probably use to, you can probably see large fishing boats in it, things like that, but that is very expensive, and in many situations, and this goes away from remote sensing a little bit, I mean, most vessels have to carry some kind of transponder so that you can actually track them. Depending on where you are in the world, these data can be available or not, especially like in Europe, the people in the fishing industry just don't want to know others where they are actually fishing. So these would be much more suitable data than trying to figure it out from satellite images, for example, if they are available. Meg.
Andy, where have you been hiding that fantastic suit?
So I was I was hiding it in a store. It was waiting in a store for me. It's pretty new. Thank you. Okay.
On that note.
Thank you.